phone or press star 6 on your phone. And when you're done, please mute again. Onto the approval of the minutes. Are there any amendments to the minutes? Charles?
I would like to make a motion to approve the minutes.
I second.
I think I have one amendment. I'm sorry, just give me one moment to find that page, if there are no additional amendments. Go there. On page 4, it says, bylaws be updated with non-gender neutral language. It should be updated with gender neutral language, yeah. And so with that amendment, we have a motion to approve as amended.
I vote to approve as amended.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you. Kathy, would you please take the roll?
Commissioner Lark,
Yes.
Commissioner Yanasak,
Abstain.
Commissioner McGinn,
Yes.
Commissioner Zelinski,
Yes.
Commissioner Atkins,
Yes.
Chair Chatters.
Yes. Thank you, Kathy. On to reports. Do any commissioners have reports?
Nothing significant to report.
Okay, staff comments?
Good evening, Chair Chatters, members of the Commission. York Stevens Wajda, Planning Director for the city. Only note today is an update on the light rail extension, Everett Link light rail extension into the city. We are in the middle of the public scoping period, which is one of the 2 or 3 most significant public participation periods for that long and significant project to the city. We are working on clarifying the staff recommendation that would go to both of our elected leaders who serve on both the Sound Transit Board and the elected leadership group for their consideration, as well as to the City Council for their consideration. On the preferred alternative, which is what this stage of the decision is about, is taking for all of the stations in the operations and maintenance facility and the alignments, narrowing down further, as has already been done twice before, to a preferred alternative and a backup alternative or another alternative to be studied in the environmental review process. Sound Transit's next step after that decision would be to perform the draft environmental impact statement or create one. After which there is more process, and this is not the end of the rail line, as it were, but it is an important step in that, and it is, we're hoping for a fairly durable preferred alternative so that we can incorporate that into our comprehensive plan update and everybody can start to coalesce around that. Most of the station areas, the different alternatives are not extremely different. Sometimes they're as little as across the street from each other, but sometimes that does make a big difference. I say this both to let you know and everybody who's listening that they can find out all the information about the update process in Sound Transit's Participate Online website. They spent a lot of time getting that as clear and understandable and accessible to the public as possible. It's got all of the latest information about the trade-offs among all the different alternatives, so I encourage everyone to take a look at that, leave your comments that you have, and Sound Transit will be compiling those and sharing them with the bodies that will be making some of those recommendations and decisions. We will also be giving a briefing to the City Council on March 1st. So if you're interested in the future of light rail in the city, that could be one to tune into. And then after that, the Sound Transit's Community Advisory Group, Elected Leadership Group, and Sound Transit Board will all have their turns with making that recommendation. Sound Transit Board will have the final decision on that preferred alternative and other alternatives to advance in the process. In April, I believe, is when all that is wrapping up. So go ahead and visit the website, and I can't remember the exact name, but if you type in Everett Link and Participate Online, you will surely find it in your results. That's the only update I have right now. Still waiting for a couple of things to fall into place for the AD accessory dwelling unit ordinance to go to the city council. And we are still doing some recruitment efforts around the vacant position on the planning commission. Be happy to take any questions you have on anything, really.
Questions, comments? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Do we have any members of the public here in person to speak? Doesn't look like we do. Kathy, do we have anyone online who would like to speak?
I do have one in mind. I don't know if he wants to speak for.
Okay, thank you. And next on the agenda, we have the Housing Development Incentive Program.
All right, fantastic. Soon to join me here is Peter Baciuello with Pertit, who is the project manager on the consultant team that is supporting the city's work in this Housing Development Incentives Program, which is an implementation action of the Rethink Housing Action Plan, both of which were funded, thank you, Washington State Legislature and Department of Commerce, by state grants. And we are thrilled to have that capacity on both of these efforts. I wanted to take just a quick moment to, first introduce you to the scope of the presentation this evening. I'll give a recap quickly of where we're at in terms of progress on all of the Housing Action Plan actions and recommendations that are in there. Then we'll talk through the purpose and scope of the Housing Development Incentive Program, take a look at what some of the consultant team and staff team's findings have been with regards to the performance of our existing development incentives, some of the other study findings and recommendations, and then a few immediate implementation steps that we are taking. And then, as always, we'll close with a summary of the next steps in this program. So Rethink Housing, the last time you've been deeply involved in it was a year and a half ago or so. We handed out a handy reference in case you needed a refresher there, that is just a summary of the recommendations and from the 4 different groupings that are within the Housing Action Plan. I find this to be a helpful reference. Just wanted to give a quick progress update. We started almost immediately after it was adopted by the City Council, getting to work on implementation of it, and we've made some good progress on a number of these. Just wanted to talk through kind of what buckets we see each of these moving forward. A lot of them are part of the comprehensive plan periodic update you can see there. And I wanted to share with this kind of more full explanation of them, because sometimes the labels or the titles of each individual recommendation doesn't tell you everything about what's incorporated into it. So the very first one, accessory dwelling unit ordinance. Thank you very much for all of your good input and work on that ordinance, and that, as you know, is waiting for the City Council's consideration. The rest of the ones on the increasing housing variety are going to find a home in the periodic update process. We are working that into the both alternatives to study as well as some of the policy work. This is also tied to another grant work program that we have going on with the Middle Housing Grant that has a real tie into the facilitating greater diversity and choice in housing in the city. And then making sure that those housing choices and capacity measures are well thought in terms of design and fit within the community. The reducing parking minimums, this shows up 1 or 2 places in the Rethink Housing Action Plan. That was incorporated after a lot of great discussion here into the ADU ordinance, which is a small slice of it, but an example of the kind of discussions that the Housing Action Plan recommends that we take throughout residential and potentially non-residential, well, no, this is a Housing Action Plan, so residential development throughout the city. In the development on urban corridors bucket, you can see the 2 HDIP. That is work that we folded into this development incentives work program. You see a couple more that are tied to the periodic update there. Number 2.6, maintain and enhance local environmental quality in streetscapes, really talks about bringing amenities into different areas of the city to help support that, support the growth and attract the development. Last year's parks, recreation, and open space planning effort did some of this. Parks and having parks and recreation opportunities and trails and things like that in close proximity to housing was mentioned in Rethink Housing, and that plan has made some significant strides there. And then the periodic update will pick that up with the rest of it. Transit-oriented communities. To the extent that this focuses on the light rail station areas, which it mainly does, although we also have transit-oriented communities centered on bus rapid transit routes on Evergreen Way. We have the periodic update is going to pick up a lot of that. The Model Code Partnership is another grant-funded work program that was a Federal Transit Administration grant to Sound Transit and Snohomish County, Linwood, and Everett together. It's a 4 or 5 year, it's a long work program, and it's focused on making the most of the light rail extension with sub-area planning and common regulations and plans and policies and all of that to, again, make the most of the light rail station. It dovetails really well with a lot of the suggestions in the Rethink Housing Action Plan Transit-Oriented Communities section. Promoting affordable housing options in TOD areas also touches on the HDIP work that we're going to talk about tonight. And then lastly, in affordability and displacement, there's a bucket there called Housing Work Plan, and that's things that we are working on that don't really fit neatly into the comprehensive plan update. We put together a memo on tenant protections and anti-displacement measures a little bit ago and forwarded that to the council, and are continuing to work at a staff level on how to advance the kind of tenant protections side of housing stability. Financial assistance programs is something that Community Development Department works constantly in, and they apply a lot of federal housing funds towards that exact need. Same thing with direct financial assistance to tenants and homeowners. And the Everett surplus lands inventory and strategy, we've done a little bit of work on that. That's a topic, our surplus lands, to the extent that we have surplus lands, are a hot commodity. I don't think I've seen a single action plan in the city that doesn't have some goals for or desires on that surplus land. The alleviating homelessness plan, again, something that community development staff are working hard on. Then you see 3 more actions that are captured within the HDIP work program. And we couldn't go a slide without mentioning the comprehensive plan update, the specific affordable housing targets. That's actually something that we're working, collaborating with our regional partners, the county and the other cities within it, to implement state guidance on affordable housing targets. Our next step is going to be what to do with those affordable housing targets. That's going to be the harder part. Mobile home park management policy was part of the tenant displacement work, and community land trusts is something that we're looking at in the periodic update, but also working just with partners that do that sort of work to see where that could fit within the city. Are there any questions about the progress on the housing action plan? I think it's important to keep an eye on those and make sure that you know that we are working on them every day.
Could I get this slide?
Sure.
Or like just the whole
Yep.
plan progress slides?
Yep. We'll send you the whole slide deck, and yeah, we'll send you the whole slide deck.
Thank you.
Okay, and then this housing development incentive program, you saw the actions that it's implementing on the last slide. It's always nice when you can knock out 4 actions for the price of one implementation program. And Peter Bacciuello, again, project manager of a consultant team headed by Pertit with a couple other partners as part of it. We've been working hard on this project for, 9 months or so? 6 months? Since July, yeah. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Just if we could just back up to that last slide, I just wanted to bring a reminder to the commission about really why we're doing this work, and it really is taken right from the Housing Action Plan. The absence of availability and affordability within the community is hard, and there needs to be something that the city can begin to make progress on. So I think that's really a key for us to provide a tool through incentive programs and looking at which ones we can optimize. And that was really the purpose of our role in helping the city through this study. So we took a number of inputs from industry. One of the things that we really wanted to focus on with this study was making sure that we understood why developers saw obstacles or identified what it was that was making it harder for a developer to make an investment in Everett than elsewhere. We utilized a consultant that I've worked with many times, Brian O'Connor. He's now at Cushman Wakefield. He's an appraiser and forecaster for developers in the multifamily industry, specifically ranging in that 50 to 250 unit range. So very in tune. So we relied on that sort of framework for our inputs to the project. We went back to Andrew Bourne at Burke, who did the Housing Action Plan financial analysis, and asked him to take some of the inputs that Brian produced and run them through an update, and then just evaluated a number of other aspects of what was causing the obstacle or what was reducing the incentive for investors to come to town. The report also generated some outputs, which were looking specifically at 3 fee waiver programs, and we'll talk about those. So first was to look at your current programs and how they were performing, and really we found that over the last 10 years, or at least with the fee waiver and exemption over the last 5 years, there'd been a lot of activity that the city had waived fees to allow 355 new housing units, and under a current, thank you, Legislature and Department of Commerce, another program that's being funded now for utility infrastructure connections, the big Four Corners, did I get it right this time? Four Corners project up there in the old Kmart site is putting 430 new affordable units on the ground. So it's been working, this fee waiver and exemption program, producing affordable units. Let's take a look at the other multifamily exemption program. We went back 10 years, and you can see that there is a number of projects that have requested the exemption. Some things to note. Most of those projects are in Metro Everett, and we see those as the Marquee or the Arrow Apartments. The master plan communities, that's Waterfront Place down at the port or over at Riverside, Riverfront, where the new developments are going in. And then the urban corridor projects, 3 out of 4 of those projects are actually buildings up at the college that were developed initially as student housing and then transitioned to unrestricted or available for the public. But what you can see is that the number of units of affordable and the number of new units being developed under this program is pretty substantial. And there's a real key here. There's 2 things. Not only is it the number of units, it's the new number of units. As if we look back the previous 7 to 15 years, the amount of new housing stock being developed in the city of Everett on the scale that we're looking at just just wasn't occurring. So we have an older stock that we have to consider. So the new is an important part of this. And we'll go to the last slide. The one incentive program that we looked at that wasn't working, and we wanted to figure out why, and that was the height bonus density program. What we really found out from talking with our partners and collaborators in industry and the private investment world, it costs them more to go higher than the exemption is being provided for. The building code means when you get over 6 stories, you have different cost requirements. If you're going into steel construction, costs go significantly higher. And fire code requirements are enhanced with sprinkler systems. It doesn't pencil to go higher, even with the offer of some bonus density on the lot. It's not only the bonus density they're being offered to go higher, but there's also a fee associated with each individual unit that they want to go higher. So what we found is it just is a public benefit program, which would be nice, but no developer can make it pencil for their investment. So at least under current code and current market conditions. So that was how it was performing. Then we took what was performing and we took the numbers that we found and we began to really look at details and what's changed since the HAP analysis was done. We updated the financial work. Andrew at Burke put together an update. He looked at this range, the type size. We'd really defined this 50 to 150 unit as the representative project that we wanted to analyze because it is the type of units that are getting built. If you look at Redmond and you look at Bothell, it's, you know, these 150 unit 3-story woody walk-ups or some 120 unit higher rise like you see in downtown Bothell. There's not a lot of 400 unit, 600 unit. And honestly, the comparabilities on unit sizes when we get down into the 24s or the 16s makes it really hard to do comparison across the board. So we fit in this window here. And we looked at a couple of different types and a couple of different zoning scenarios. And then he updated the financial model and really reaffirmed some of the things that we'd been hearing not only from industry but other jurisdictions that were challenged with this and some of the reports from Commerce. The gap, the range between the cost to build and the cost to operate and return on investment is so narrow these days that it continues to make it hard without an incentive to put a project on the ground. The MFTE program is a catalyst for stimulating new housing. And if you structure a few components of it and broaden the area incentives that it can work in, it should stimulate or catalyze more multifamily housing in places that the city would prefer to see it. Height, as we mentioned before, and parking, as Yorick mentioned earlier, continue to be big rocks that are part of the discussion in every development scenario or in every development agreement that's being worked on, every permit process. And I know he's working on plans to rectify that. And then continue to support the affordability goals with the impact fee waivers. So that was what Andrew felt was the outcome of looking at the financials. Go to the next. Commerce asked us in their grant to make sure we were looking at all the incentives that were available in the area to support affordable housing and how did the city of Everett consider those. And it was really interesting, just last year, the master builders of King and Snohomish County put together this permit incentives analysis toolkit. So we had a real nice source to start from, and we supplemented that with the model code work that Yorick and Becky have been working on, and looked at some other programs with different cities and recent planning efforts in certain communities in the Seattle area to see how they were developing specific code around affordability incentives. We also reached out to some ongoing consultants who are working a lot around the sound transit development, but sound communities, organization that's trying to look at ways to establish land banking legislation for transit-oriented development areas. What we found was really interesting. There aren't a whole lot of levers left to pull with the city of Everett. You know, your code is fraught with incentives that are being used throughout the region and are available legislatively. Some could be tweaked some more, and there's a few ideas that we looked at that hadn't been on the books. But I think the key takeaway from this is that the incentive programs that are typically being used out there in the community and they're supported by legislation are being used or are in some form on the books with the city of Everett. And I would really suggest you take a look at the table in section 5 of the report if you haven't seen it already. I think it represents some really good work by the planning department over the last decade to ensure that they're adopting new legislation to stimulate housing. Unfortunately, it's just the market hasn't been there to make it work. The others is that the incentives that are available to stimulate housing or catalyze new growth, they really fall into 4 categories, and we're going to talk about those in a minute. We reached out to communities and let them know what we were doing, solicited some input from housing associations and others. But we spent a lot of time listening and engaging with development communities, people that have developed in this community for years, folks that have used the MFTE here and in other regions, folks that have thought about developing different types of multifamily product in Everett, maybe not doing so because they had a different direction to go. So we got a lot of feedback on the people, your partners in the future that need to bring the checkbook to make these housing projects work. This is what we were trying to get from them. And again, the one theme from everybody, including housing agents, was reduce your permit timelines. The cost of carrying money through a permit process is really hard to do, recognizing that a lot of these developers have to carry that cost themselves before they can get to a construction bond to build their project. So they need to try to keep that short because that's all the money they've got to get their project up. We heard that fee simple townhome ownership would be a neat thing to do. Townhome builders are very interested, and the fee simple townhome option works, and there's now a new MFTE program for affordable home ownership. Some things with setbacks and walkability. But again, parking and permit timelines were the 2 big things that we heard from the private development groups. So we talked about the groupings of the available incentives, and these are the incentives that we actually looked at to carry forward for our feasibility testing, just to kind of see how they stacked up against some criteria. And we grouped them into regulatory. This is what's available legislatively through code or authorized by the state legislature. Administrative, these are things that planning department or the mayor or staff could implement just by, setting a priority to move some projects higher up on the priority list. Obviously, capacity near transit is on everybody's mind, or at least I hope it is. The sound transit is coming, but the blue line, the green line, the orange line, community transit's work to connect better to Marysville is all on the table long before the train arrives in town. And then affordability. Our mandate was to make sure we were looking at ways to incentivize new housing at all levels. But affordability is probably a huge part of the need that the city has, so it really became a piece that became prominent in what we were considering through these incentive programs. So that's quite a bit. Any questions in the interim, or shall we keep plowing forward?
Thank you. Out of curiosity, you mentioned the delta between operational costs, construction costs, and rent revenue was razor thin. Can you talk us a little bit through that? Like, how small is it?
Well, we actually have, if you go to the smaller detail in the back of the book, somewhere in here, I might have to dig for it, but it's in the financial analysis that was done by Cushman Wakefield.
Are we talking the September 23rd, 2022 memo in the back?
Yeah.
So, yeah, if it says Cushman Wakefield, then appendix, not G anymore, right? Appendix H, which is the update to appendix G,
Yes.
the Burke memo. Both of them have a wealth of financial.
What
data.
I can do, Commissioner Lark, is make sure that I can send you the link and the spreadsheets, and if you'd like to follow up specifically, I can say that out of the scenarios that we looked at, 2 different housing types in separate zones, so we had 4 different analyses to do.
Okay.
Only one of them penciled without an incentive to support it.
Roger that. I guess a little more context to the question is that, I understand the market conditions aren't here, but the need is still here. And so as we think about, going back to my training as an Army planner, we do things called shaping operations, changing the environment to achieve our end states and setting conditions. So part of me is like, well, if we can't do it with a classic maneuver unit, we find a new way to set conditions to achieve victory. And so when I think here, building more units, making more housing available, like we have a market initiative, we have a market effort, but what about a non-market effort? Like where we're looking at the city, nonprofits generating and developing not-for-profit. So this is why I want to ask about the profit component viability, because if we say, let's just nix the profit incentive and have agencies that are not interested in profits building workforce housing, building housing that helps change and set conditions to allow for greater rents, to make the environment more amenable to market conditions, what can we do be done there?
Well, I think we've looked at a number of incentive programs associated with affordability and supporting the non-for-profit or the low-income developer that is focused in that area. And we'll get to some of those. So these are some of the incentives that you see on the right. The new multifamily tax exemption incentive provides both a 12-year and a 20-year program for setting aside rent-restricted units for affordability, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The other thing that I think I like you talking about the lever, yes, we have legislative tool and we can give an incentive, but what else can we do? I would look to the list of administrative possibilities that are available. There's a lot of work that's been done over the last decade to identify where development should be occurring and how to at least recognize the places to look. And I think that through the existing MFTE ordinance and the RTAs that it establishes, I think looking back to the Evergreen Way ordinance and master plan at some of the nodes, which were really the basis for those MFTE RTAs, and then leveraging some of the newer development in the region to administratively promote a style of development that you want based on what we see at Waterfront Place or at Riverside. So, pardon me, Riverfront. I was involved with the Riverside development deal, so. So I think those tools are available to the city through administrative action, and we talk about that in some detail in the plan. So does that answer your question?
A little bit. I think it's still dancing around the analysis that we are expecting private firms to do this. My question is, how rigorously have we explored, not like, because you mentioned nonprofits and you're talking housing affordability, low-income individuals. It came out of Housing Hope. I understand the financial challenges for that. I'm talking about us, using our like nonprofit components or zero profit or institutions that aren't interested in it to build housing for the demographic that traditionally the market would want to capture, but at this point, given the market conditions, they just can't.
I understand your point. I think, the one challenge that any non-for-profit has today, they've got some access to money, which makes it easier for them, and they're a non-taxed unit, so their pro formas are pretty different. But they're still going out to a private developer. They're still hiring a master planner. They're still hiring a contractor, and each of those folks have profit built in. It's the nature of the game. They have some different tools that allow them to get that lower income housing, and I think that we should continue to incentivize them. And I think we have some tools in this housing development incentive program to keep that element of affordability moving forward.
Roger that, thank you.
Thank you. I had a couple.
Commissioner Yanosek?
Thank you. I had a couple questions. One, I saw various things when we were talking about with regard to affordable housing. Just the definition of that is always somewhat elusive to me. We talked about it at. I saw numbers in like at 30%, 50%, 80% of AMI. When you're talking in this context, affordable housing, what would be the what do we need to? How do we need to define that?
So affordability gets based on a lot of different things. In the context of this document and our analysis, we like to go to area median income. And that's a number that's developed by the Housing and Urban Development, and they publish it from time to time. It is the basis number that we used in our financial market analysis to see, what were the costs and what was the market for building these types of developments that we see going in communities.
So when you're saying affordable housing, you're talking, and is generally then that would be something that someone making AMI, somebody earning the AMI would be able to afford at about 30% of their income?
No, it's a little bit different. That is a way that it does get defined in the context of what we're talking about tonight. I think what the best thing for us to do is focus on 80% of the area median income qualifies as an 80% AMI. If you only make 60% of the area median income, you qualify in that 60% rent restricted zone. That's the intent of our study.
But Peter, the affordable rent level is generally at the 30% for whichever economic segment that you're looking at.
Yes, so,
Okay.
yes.
So there's two levels. There's 30, 50, and 80, but within those, then it would be affordable if wherever you fall in there, you're at 30% of.
They will typically base HUD will typically base housing costs on 30% of income as an affordability level, although they have been going higher lately. So, but that's a safe assumption, 30% of your income goes to housing costs.
Okay. I had another question. One of your first slides there talked about how the multifamily tax exemptions that produce so many units that utilize that, and then a certain percentage of those were affordable. Is there any way to tease out from that, though, how much the incentive played into that? I mean, certainly the developer took advantage of that, but what if it hadn't existed? Does that mean the whole project wouldn't have happened? Does that mean there would have been maybe fewer units? I mean, is there any way to tease that out to know that there's actually a correlation as opposed to just or there's actually causation as opposed to just correlation? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, and I think you bring up a very good point. The investors that are utilizing this MFTE, they have a specific goal in mind for the type of development that they'd like to put on the ground. They utilize the MFT to make that work for them and balance a few things like the carrying cost of money or the risk of construction cost delays or cost of material changes. I would also say, though, that if they didn't take the incentive, they'd probably end up building a different type of project, or they would take the project they wanted to build somewhere else.
Yeah. Anyway, I guess that was just something that occurs to me that it's hard. I imagine it's very hard to find the causation element of that.
The pro forma information I'm going to send to Commissioner Lark, it's multi-pages of Excel spreadsheets that have so many assumptions and and analysis built into them. There's a lot that goes into, the MFT is just one line item in there. There's a whole lot of other things that go into that.
Although it just occurred to me that, I mean, it'd be kind of nice if somehow you could tease that out to really know the effectiveness of the MFTE, other than that, yes, it's working in the sense that it's being utilized, but how necessarily, is it a driving force? Is it just something that is there so people are catching it because it's there, but if it wasn't there, what would it look like, as opposed to what if it was more aggressive? Would it actually?
I would say that all of the developers that we talked to, two in particular were very blunt that they could not have done the project without the MFTE. Those two projects produced over 240 units in downtown Everett, new units. So the other thing that I would focus on more than is how would it change without it, is this that we put 664 units of affordable housing on the ground in the last 10 years from the multifamily tax exemption program. And it's created new apartments that are setting new market, which will bring more new apartments along with it. So we'll get to a couple of ideas on how we might be able to manage that here in a little bit.
Thank you.
Commissioner Lark?
In that answering, you reminded me of another question I had. Outside of reducing the permit time, to mitigate carrying costs as the project's being developed, what other incentives have other institutions utilized other than just shortening the overall time? Like, has there been like grants or loans or zero interest loans offered by municipalities to developers to ameliorate those costs or challenges?
There's development agreements, and each of those development agreements comes with commitments between the developer and what the city will provide, and that's just a very specific project, lot-specific type of action. But I would think that there's some other tools that help. The Planned Action EIS is a really nice tool. Sub-area plans that'll be an outcome of the periodic update will be very, very valuable. The one thing that I've learned through my years of working in the development community is that they want certainty. The more certainty you can provide a developer, the more interested he's going to be in his project. And if you look at what's happened recently for new stuff, Waterfront Place and Riverfront, there's a lot of certainty around those because those projects have been planned for 20 years. They're very clear in how they're going to be developed. There was a lot of certainty about what the public agency was involved with and what the private agent was expected to do. It wasn't just the market building housing. It was a real concerted effort. So those are some other tools that are available beyond just the incentive program. As far as just getting into the development business as a municipality, I don't know that that's necessarily the city of Everett's purpose or in their best interest. And using legislation and available tools like MFTE or Planned Action EIS as sub-area plans, those would be the upzones would be another tool. Those would be the things that I think the city would be best to focus on.
Roger that, thank you.
Commissioner Zelinski?
Yes, one thing I found interesting in the report was the distinction between two types of developers, the so-called merchant developer, I guess, who is in it to build and sell and is so looking at return on investment. That's what their pro forma looks like. And I forget what the other type was called, but they're the ones who are looking at long-term. They'll hold the property and look at the income generated afterwards. Is that second group primarily the nonprofits that we're talking about?
No,
Not
actually,
necessarily?
that is an approach that's been used in downtown Everett. That's the model of development from, let's say, 1990 through 2010, 2015. The majority of the buildings that were built were for a person that was more interested in being a property management owner, retainer, and the building is a nice vehicle that has equity in it, but it's about running the business instead of selling the investment.
Would you conclude that there's one or other of the type that would be the primary target for our incentives?
Both have used the incentives. The incentive works for both of them. I think that the emphasis in the report around the difference between the two is we haven't in Everett realized that much merchant investment, because they can come in, can they build something, can they operate it for 4 years and sell it? And does that return work for them? Can they get the rents they need to make that pencil? And I think that that is one of the reasons we just haven't seen so much, because the merchant developers, which are the majority of the investors these days, they just don't see the Everett market as a place that'll turn on a 5-year project.
Thank you.
Why aren't we seeing ownership opportunities happening in the dense housing models in Everett?
Well, let's see. Ownership opportunities in dense housing, that's primarily the condominium option. I'm trying to think, we could talk about townhomes, but it's sort of, one of the models we looked at was townhomes. But if we look about the condominium, it's a lot to do with the legislative requirements around liability for the builder who has to carry all of the risk for the condo association for 8 years before he doesn't have to carry that risk. There's a very long carry. So a lot of builders don't want to have that. They want to build it, they want to get it rented up, they want to turn it or be a property manager. They don't want to carry the potential risk that goes with a condo association and a homeowners association.
And has anybody addressed co-op situations? Has that been introduced?
We haven't looked at co-op multifamily.
I'll throw out one more on the condo front. I read up on it this morning, went and visited the county council is having a series, Snohomish County Council is having a series on affordable home ownership, and condos has to come up, and the liability thing is, I think, what really tanked the development market for condominiums. But then there were two other factors. One is that rental is so profitable because I think some of the scarcity in the product has driven the rents up so high that if you're looking at the two, you're going to lean towards the rental market now. And then capital gains tax. There was a whole article on why British Columbia sees so many condos and we do not. And I think it's a factor of the US tax code that when you build an apartment building and then rent it out, you spread that investment and your gains over a long period of time. When you build a condo development and you have to sell 110 units all in 1 year, that's quite a hefty capital gains all at once that you cannot combine with losses elsewhere in your company as effectively, and it winds up with a heavy tax bill. And then the uncertainty of having to sell all of them in one fell swoop versus, I think there's a little bit more tolerance for vacancy for a short period of time with the rental units. Those are a couple of things I learned this morning.
There's a lot more condo conversion of older apartment buildings as the concern over buildability and construction, eventually wanes after that period. So then a lot of apartments, I can say that the conversation was pretty deep around Waterfront Place. Would that go condominium after its period? And it still may, but.
Commissioner Lark?
First off, Commissioner McGinn, excellent question. It's triggered a series of other questions. So I'm very interested. So when you talk about the risk and you say it's the builder's risk, is it the general contractor? Like, who exactly holds the risk?
That's all going to depend on how the money is structured and who's signing the agreement. So it's the owner of the property, and how that is structured, that just depends.
So if it goes back to like the co-op concept where you aggregate a series of owners who pool money and then build a condo, say just like a fourplex condo in like a small quiet neighborhood, they're the ones who owned it, built it, and then live in it. They don't sell it, so they don't have the capital gains problem. And then with regard to their, like, the risk, like, was it the subcontractors they had buy it? Or if they're the general contractor, they hold the risk because they're going to raw land, building a home, for themselves. Who owns the risk in that situation?
Well, the risk is the owners of the condo. So if you've got 4 people that share a risk on a single building, that's where concern comes.
But they would be, if they found after that 8-year period of risk, like basically they would just be suing themselves. They're like, oh, we didn't build this well enough. Stub my own toe and I'll get the guy who built it. It would be, they're pointing the finger at themselves in that case, right?
Yeah, I find the lack of ownership opportunity to be a huge disadvantage to the city for our long-term sustainable growth. I mean, we can look to other communities. I think I would not look to Bothell or or Redmond for, you know, how we can maintain our own growth. I don't find that those communities, I don't find them to be livable. But I think, you know, yes, maybe we can't address the tax issue on our own as a municipality, but certainly we can address incentives that don't exist for co-ops. I think that it's a shame that maybe a lot of people don't know that co-ops are even an option. You know, that kind of educational component can be a big tool for the city. It's a missing link in my assessment of what we're building.
Commissioner Lark?
Well put. Refining back to the co-op, I mean, when I worked at Housing Hope, we had a program where families it was funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they would build sweat equity homes, modest sweat equity homes. And what we would do, part of our job as the regional contractor for them, was to aggregate families. I mean, going back to what we're talking about, like, I mean, in theory, it sounds like the city could create and put out an RFP for a nonprofit to aggregate families who can go to, because like these families go to the bank and collect just a regular FHA loan or, you know, mortgage or construction loan, and then we'd aggregate them, these families. They would then build this home through sweat equity, or, you know, maybe in another case with it being a small condo, perhaps you would have you know, more professional contractors do most of it. You would then have them basically build a small condo, assume the liability for themselves in case they somehow needed to execute liability against themselves. And then you would also avoid the capital gains because you wouldn't be selling it. I mean, has there been institutions or other cities that have decided to do this way? I mean, look, we have these challenges. There's always a way around the defensive fortification. You just got to start probing.
I'm not aware of others that have implemented co-op, but I would also say that the solution to housing in Everett is thousands of units per year, if not more. And co-op, it's a good program. I think it would be great to see. It's going to generate 100 units a year. So it's a tool that's in the box. I think we're trying to pull a little bit bigger lever with this program and seeing if we can catch up, because I think we're all aware that the city of Everett's a little behind right now.
Commissioner Yanis?
If I could add, you had more to go on your presentation, right? So maybe I'll come back to something. I guess maybe, I just want to get to that point you're just talking about. The solution is thousands and thousands of units, and I mean, obviously, I think that's the case. What I took away from reading this, and it was interesting to me that one of the components of that to drive that would actually be somehow increasing rents, that we need more rents. We need housing to essentially become more unaffordable so that we can get more stock. I mean, was I seeing that kind of correctly? It just seems like a strange dichotomy, and I guess I still haven't wrapped my head quite around that kind of concept. I can understand what it means, but it seems somewhat counter to other efforts.
Well, when we look at housing for all income levels, which is part of what we're doing, the average rent in Everett being lower than the state average means that people just aren't building new.
Right.
They cannot get the rents. They look at that average. You go on rent.com, you know, $1,750. Well, that's the bottom of the barrel for affordability levels. They can't get the rents that they need to be able to build the units. So we need units at 2,200. We need units at 2,500. We need luxury units because there really isn't a lot of luxury housing available in Everett. So yes, I get your understanding that it's the low rents that are keeping private investment from being here, so we've got to get the rents up. Well, actually, what we need to do is get the private investment here, the rents will go up by themselves. And yes, it will mean that there's a lot higher rents. But frankly, you know, the cost of a 60% AMI unit at about $1,900 for a family of three, that's already pretty steep. So yes, that number will also increase.
So is it somewhat like a chicken and egg problem? I mean, if the units were built, would they come? If you build them, will they come? Or do you have to, I don't understand the market dynamics well enough to kind of understand how that works, but I mean, if we could get a developer in to build $3,500 a month apartments, would they be able to fill them?
Well, we'll use Waterfront Place as an example because I know it. I'm intimate with it. They had a 737-person waiting list for 235 units a year before they opened the doors. So I would say there's pent-up demand for units. I mean, the Marquee filled up in 2 weeks, 3 weeks.
Yeah.
I watched it from my office. It's right across the street.
So then how is that, if you're a developer, how are you not looking at that pent-up demand and saying, well, I can come in, I don't need to have the rents existing now, I can make the rents that I need by building a unit that
You
demands
still will have to meet what the market is bearing for rent in the region, and the Marquee used the MFTE 8-year program. It's the only thing that made that project pencil for 77 new units that are all full, and that is stimulating a lot of activity in downtown with 125 people there on Wetmore. So there's a lot of value in just generating the volume of housing. And I would say if you build it, they will come. I will say if we can get developers to build apartments where we see up and down the corridor, more developers will build more apartments up and down the corridor because everybody follows somebody that was successful with something.
Has the Nimbus project opened yet?
I think Dan made the grand opening a few weeks
I
ago.
think we have at least a temporary certificate of occupancy, and we've
How many units are in that project?
165, and I know that off the top of my head because I use that as my stock, 6 Nimbuses per 1,000 units as we're
Right.
working on our.
And that was primarily market rate units. Are there any affordable units in that project?
Not dedicated, no. So it was
No,
the
okay.
8-year MFTE with no affordability components.
Okay. Okay.
Any additional comments, questions? Commissioner Yanosek, you have a look in
I'm
your eye.
sorry to hijack this.
Yeah.
Kind of on that point, something else also occurred to me. When they do use the MFTE to build an affordable unit, who administers that? Who ensures that it does in fact go to a person who meets that qualification for that amount of time? Okay, so there is somebody actually, I mean, looking at the lease and guaranteeing.
There are, when the ordinance actually floats and you'll get a chance to look at the draft, you'll see that the requirements are pretty extensive. We all sat through a commerce briefing for an hour a few weeks back just to talk about what was required by April 1st to report on the current MFTE. So one of the things that we're actually considering and is being talked about would be engaging with the housing agents in town to help take on some of that administration because they're really in the business of counting affordable units.
And just to fill that out, we are refreshing and rebuilding our MFTE program right now, but the property owners and the building managers would need to check the income verification from each tenant. So if you have a 80% AMI unit, you have to demonstrate and sign an affidavit that your income of the household is under that level. And then the rent would need to be under 30% of that level, and there's a couple different ways to arrange that. So the building manager is the one in charge of the paperwork, and then every year they file a report with the city, and then there are occasional audits from the state on it to make sure that this is all on the up and up.
Before we move on, thank you for all of those questions and comments. That was really a great discussion. And as a longtime affordable housing advocate, it has been kind of shocking for it to recently come into my consciousness, the implications to our economy to not offer housing for high income earners and what that means when they cannot find housing here in the city to our business community. So it's a both and situation, not a either or. So that's really good to know that. I wanted to circle back to two things. One, you said spreadsheet. I would like that, if you don't mind. Two, the administrative options, the permit timeline reduction, was there a target range that was given, a percent of time, the builders want to see it reduced by 30% of the time that it takes? Was there some kind of target that they had in mind that would be like a meaningful point that would change their numbers?
We didn't specifically analyze the carrying cost for over time, but I did hear from individuals that the difference between 9 months and 18 months on a $55 million project is really significant money. And it makes a big difference in how their pro forma develops. So that, I think, is the best finding I can give you.
Okay, thank you.
And I want, if I could add to that, it's a matter of the permit timelines, and of course, we've got a hardworking permit review team here at the city, and they do everything they can to look at the different aspects of the process and try to streamline it. Even before you get to the actual permit in the door, and there's so much that goes into that. We hear always about this permit timeline reduction from developers, there are a couple bills in Olympia right now seeking to kind of enforce some limits on that. And I totally agree that is, you're carrying an interest rate, a pretty high interest rate on a construction loan in every single day, let alone the potential that you might lose contractors and things like that. So we're all on board with doing everything we can to streamline and get our reviews turned around quickly through all of the different disciplines. Having a clear code and a predictable code up front is, I think, equally important to this, because it's not always on our side, the delays, although it still may be rooted in the city's regulations. So every time we send out a correction letter that says you have to fix these 12 things in your project, I have to imagine that becomes much more likely that you have multiple rounds of corrections if the code is confusing or ambiguous, because they will have thought that they had it just right. And if they give us a perfect plan and a perfect plan set, we will be able to review that very quickly. If there are a lot of changes, then they have to go back to the architects, they have to go back to the civil team and everything and make those changes, which stretches it out much more actually than 1 or 3 more days of our processing time. And you all have a role as we bring changes to our development regulations to you over time. Really appreciate that look for clarity and unambiguity. Certainty. Yes.
Acuity?
Acuity.
Thank you. Additional, or are we ready to move on? Commissioner Zelinski?
I'm sorry, I just have one additional question that occurred to me. I'm wondering, does the staff know whether Everett has any recent experience with co-investing in private projects for certain, like, public amenity elements of projects to help increase the amenity value of the city? Because one of the sort of subliminal messages in here is that communities attract both investors and new residents with amenities. And if we're perceived as being short on amenities, that might be one area where the city could provide an incentive to developers that I don't think has really been covered in this document. Do you happen to know offhand?
I will agree that that's an important piece, and I think we're working on it through our Parks Department, we're working transportation, we're working economic development. The whole city government is aligned to increase the attractiveness and the amenities available to Everett, and that is something that would be free to a developer, that increases the value of their product without them having to invest any. Challenge with a budget a tight budget city. So how we, we look for grants, we look for private partners and everything. But as you can see with Riverfront, Waterfront Place, there's amenities springing up around it. We're building parks, we're building new water access, and that's attracting the investment and helping to support that. And that feeds on itself too, because a lot of those amenities aren't something that would be provided by the public. It is shopping and dining and coffee shops around the corner, and we need to attract private investment to do those and maintain those businesses too. So I don't know of specific examples other than our general focus is absolutely to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. So we looked at incentives for further analysis, and this was coming out of the feasibility study and looking at how we could move some things forward. And it really was the purpose of the Commerce Grant. We looked at the three key incentives and the new system connection fees, which include now, currently does not include, but we're proposing to include the parks fee waiver as part of this new system fee connection ordinance. So we ran the incentives that you saw on the Foursquare slide. We ran those through some feasibility criteria, and we spent a lot of time talking about what was important as far as evaluating each of these different incentives that we were looking at. And what we saw was you need a policy framework of some kind to put one in place. And whether that's the periodic plan update, whether that's the Housing Development Incentive Program itself, whether that's new city ordinances, regulations, or whether it's a new master plan that comes out, there needs to be some framework for them. We need to make sure that whatever housing incentive we're offering is actually producing new units, because that's the real mission that we have. We need to make sure that the implementation of those incentives doesn't overburden the city with cost or overwhelm staff with capacity of management. And we need to make sure there's available funding for those incentives. So the next couple of pages kind of summarize the tables that you see, Table ES1 and 7.1 of the housing report. We just took the ones that we were looking at under the four headings, and we did the analysis from them. And you can keep scrolling ahead, Yorick, I think. I just would refer you to the tables, and our outcome of this feasibility assessment was we wanted to look at the, if we go to the next one. Yeah, next slide. Yeah. Oh, that was it. That's the last one you have. Okay. So that's all right, because I remember having looked at the one that had the last three slides on it. The outcome of this was basically that we're recommending moving forward with the multifamily tax exemption program. And there is an 8-year program. We're recommending that the 8-year program be implemented with no affordability as a catalyst to activate new housing. We want to carry forward with the 12-year MFTE program, which is in place, but we want to expand not expand. We want to not regulate, what's the word I'm looking for? We want to make the incentive thresholds consistent across the entire city. Right now, different incentive thresholds exist in different MFTE zones, and we want to make sure we're standardizing those across the board. That's what we're looking for. Oh, yeah. Thanks. There we are. I got it. Yeah. Thank you, Becky. Yorick.
So we mentioned the fee exemptions, the two. So just on to implementation, we're working on 3 ordinances that we're gonna forward to the city council here shortly that implement 3 of that list of the recommendations. The rest of them, I think we'll toss into the same bucket as the housing action plan, and maybe next time you see a progress update, you'll see the recommendations from the housing action plan plus the recommendations that were added from this housing development incentives program. And then of those, we've got 3 immediate implementation actions that are part of this grant-funded work program. The first 2 are reinstating the system connection fee exemptions for low-income housing, and then implementing the park impact fee exemption for affordable housing projects. And I note that the Planning Commission directly addressed this question with the park impact fee ordinance and recommended not approving it, which is the city council agreed with that recommendation and did not include an impact fee waiver program for that. But with the new information from this housing development incentives program and especially the development feasibility information and the need to find support wherever we can, we thought it was worth taking a fresh look at that. And then also the biggest and probably most impactful, as we've mentioned a couple times, is the multifamily tax exemption ordinance and a refresh and an expansion of that program, which is what Peter was diving into. But I think I reordered his slides. So that should get us back on track here with the
Thank
multifamily
you,
tax
thank you.
exemption.
So, the MFTE program, the state legislature took a hard look at it, new House bill was passed to provide a broader opportunity for jurisdictions to utilize this tool for housing. It expanded the requirements for tenant relocation assistance. It required some look at displacement and equity concerns. It had some new monitoring requirements and reporting requirements, and probably what was most ideal was it created a whole new 20-year exemption program, and the city of Everett qualifies for that under an ownership model. And I think that's really exciting because what this provides is an affordable home ownership pathway. If we find a developer that's willing to take the exemption and work with the local housing authority on it. One of the key things that we did, let's go ahead and just head to the next one. One of the key things with the MFTP program was the residential targeted areas. Previously, there were 11 zones within the city. As I mentioned earlier, they each had somewhat variable affordability thresholds. Based on discussions and objectives for growth, we've made the recommendation that the city go zone-wide in the MU, business, and UR4 zones. This provides the broadest opportunity for multifamily development under existing zoning code and gives developers the option beyond some limited spaces on the corridors and opens up a broader area to share development in.
And just to show the map, the black hatch is what is currently in the MFTE program, and the blue hatch is what those 3 zones citywide would turn into. And you can see some of the areas that would be newly added into the MFTE program here. And then the same with South Everett.
If I may, just out of curiosity, still, this strikes me, I like the idea of expansion, but it still strikes me as a markedly limited operational space to utilize this. I mean, is there any opposition or concern amongst developers for expanding it to like R3? Like, I mean, how far can you justifiably expand it? Why did we cut it R4, UR4 and just these few?
Well, City of Seattle went citywide with their program. The focus that we have is to concentrate development in the places that the city can really benefit from it the most, which is really urban corridors. And if we look at the zoning and how zoning lines up with the urban corridors within the city of Everett and future transit locations, this is really the map that says this is the area that would be best served by focusing incentives over the next decade.
Alex, that we're not going to experience the variety of scale that a city like Seattle would. Our scale is just at a very small, we have a small rise. Our high density, in our metro is like a suburban area in Seattle. So it does feel appropriate to really concentrate it on those transit corridors, acknowledging, the limits of, the townscape, I guess.
Roger, just one quick question in analyzing kind of, like, one of the things that, one lesson I've taken from Seattle is that if you concentrate the development, you hold it there until the market forces are there to create the 15, 16, 18, 30-story towers along these corridors, you have that affordability issue. And I understand the beauty and power of of clustering. It makes a lot of sense. So I understand that analysis, but what are we taking, how are we also implementing that other lesson learned from Seattle? Like, if we do cluster, we're really holding that, we're trying to make that diamond by creating that pressure artificially. So the diamonds are expensive. What can we do to also promote development throughout the city that, we do want to see the development in those areas, yes, but we also want to see affordable development to do the full spectrum of families here in the city and not have a family of four paying 40, 50%, 60% of their, income, because they're on the lower segment of the AMI spectrum. That still doesn't serve us that well. And I think that's what we saw in Seattle. So I just kind of want to see what analysis has been done for that intersection.
I think the biggest focus is on transit communities. I mean, the affordable family of three at a 60% AMI has got maybe a car. They're relying on transit heavily or walkability. And it's the urban corridors with the transit that will support these types of developments. As I mentioned earlier, volume is, the number of units is important. The size of these projects that we need to incentivize, we want to make sure we're getting, a good return on this exemption that we're offering. So it makes it a little harder to go into an UR3 zone or an R2 zone and say, yeah, 4-plex MFTE or 8-plex MFTE. I think we're looking for the opportunity to put 50 to 250 units on the ground in single steps through this project.
It's a good point, Commissioner Lark, and I think it's important that we get this right. Going to MUB and UR4 zones is a substantial increase from where we had it, which itself was a substantial increase from where I think it started not too long ago in just Metro Everett. There are some requirements in the state law in RCW 8414, which has all of the statewide requirements for MFTE, that the residential targeted area, it implies that it should be held to a central place, which arguably this is spreading a little bit out from that original mission. Seattle, obviously, if they did it citywide, was able to pass that test, and I think it's very reasonable to consider the city of Everett to be an urban center, and so I think we would feel comfortable about that. But that is one thing that is kind of keeping a lid on where we designate it. The other one is, right now we have the threshold for eligibility is going to be 16 units. I think it's at 8 now, and the proposal is to move that to 16 to kind of move it towards larger projects for administrative purposes and some others. Pretty hard to get a 16-unit project in the UR3 zone. And then I will also, this costs money. We'll talk a little bit about the tax shift, but any exemption costs money, and so we want to make sure that it is targeted to the place that's providing the best value. I think that's a great point to push on. Why not bigger? Why not smaller? And make sure that we're roughly at the right place. As it's written, as drafted, this would apply on the MU, B, and UR4 zones as they change in the future. We're crafting a comprehensive plan update that is gonna have to create capacity for another 15,000 is where we're at these days? 16,000 more housing units. That is, 6 Nimbuses per thousand, almost 100 Nimbuses more. That may entail more UR4, B, or MU zones. So this would be right now, but it could change in the near future as we work with the comprehensive plan, or maybe we wind up with a slightly different zone structure, but we could amend the MFTE ordinance to accommodate that. And then the last little note is that these zones don't always exactly connote density or height. There are a few UR3 zones with higher heights than UR4 zones that have lower heights. So just something to throw out to confuse everybody is that UR4 is not always more intense than UR3.
And Commissioner Lark, direct you to the last page, section 2 of the report. We provide a pretty detailed summary of why we think those zones meet the criteria.
Could we get a page number on that real quick?
I've got it on page 19 of the one, my working copy here. Chapter 2,
I think page 24 might be the
24?
page that you're looking for.
last page of section 2, right before section 3.
Recommendations, and then it's based on the performance of the current MFTE program and new legislation.
I would say, look at the second, or the bullet that starts, broaden the geographic influence of the MFTE programs. Oh, it might be on the previous page with the new changes.
Yeah, it's
Sorry, I'm
page
working from a little
23.
bit older document. That is straight out of the state legislation on MFTE programs and what's required to qualify. And I think we've done a very good job at describing UR4, MU, and B zones to meet that criteria citywide. Might be a harder leap at some of the other zones.
Roger that. Just one of the things, going back to what you said, certainty, ease of understanding the code, more discretion. This place has a pencil, this could pencil. Like, a goal that I have is to expand all housing here. We are woefully underpopulated in this city to be economically competitive in this world. And we just don't have enough people here and a diversity of people and incomes and talents to be competitive. And it's a danger to us, our future, and our country. So getting more people here to do more awesome things is a priority of mine.
Okay, let's see if we can bring this down the home stretch. So the other updates, we just talked about the RTAs, standardizing affordability thresholds. Yorick mentioned the minimum at 16 units. And then the 20-year MFTE option. The 20-year program allows somebody to build, get a 20-year exemption on the cost of the improvements for a commitment of 99 years affordable set-aside, and an agreement with the housing agent to monitor and administer the program for them. And then the other new piece is requiring a displacement report for any project that's receiving this tax exemption. One of the things that was required in the new legislation from the state was a consideration of equity and displacement. So we did some research, and you'll see it in one of the appendices to the document. We found that if you look at the equity and displacement map for the Puget Sound region, Everett is probably one of the most vulnerable communities in the region. And we want to make sure that if any developer is going into a community and is displacing a culturally significant business or displacing a neighborhood, that they're doing the type of assessment, and we've got documentation that they're providing assistance to those folks to find a new place.
Who pays for that?
The developer. It becomes a standard submittal, just like a geotech report or a critical areas report.
And does that somehow then cut against the incentive you're giving them in the first place? I mean, you
The-
give them
the-
something here and you take it back here and.
The relative
out?
cost is not very significant.
Okay.
It's not a big effort for them to do, but I think it's the responsibility of the city to make sure that they're doing everything they can to help affected communities that are being displaced, particularly in zones of extremely high displacement. Okay?
That's the right question, because yes, it is, the whole point of this entire program is that we need to balance our incentives on a knife's edge of exactly the right place, and we think we're near there, but yeah, that's a good question.
Okay.
And so one of the questions that's always asked is, okay, so we're giving away a tax exemption. What does that mean to city finances? How much is that going to cost the city? Well, we know that the exemption value, if we ran a little hypothetical, right? Based on market absorption, maybe 275 units a year for the next 10 years, utilizing the MFTE program. The tax exempted, the total value of the exempted tax is about $33 million, but most of that's the burden of the county. And it's possible to shift all of that tax burden to other members of the taxing district. So if the city should decide, they can ask the assessor to take that tax burden and reapply it to the remaining rooftops in the city of Everett. We found that process would just add about under $20, I think, was under $30 per rooftop per year to the residents of city of Everett. Now, what's the benefit of that tax shift? Multifamily housing that we've talked about, the need for housing at all levels, urban corridor development, which is badly needed. We'd get a number of exempt units that would be built in the community, and we would create new apartment equity. And you think, apartment equity, why do we need apartment equity? Because when we start selling apartments that were built under this program, then investors are going to have new numbers to look at to see how it pencils for a merchant investor to come to Everett, and they're going to set a trend. And more people will be coming and looking at opportunities because they'll see apartment sales, relatively new apartment sales in Everett, and that's a big driver for the apartment development community. So we've talked about the residential areas, the 20-year exemption, minimum number of units, affordability thresholds, displacement and mitigation requirements. The one thing that we haven't talked about is this 8-year program. I've said that there's an 8-year MFTE program that has no affordability standards to it, and that is a tool in the box to catalyze housing development. But you don't want to overuse it, and you don't want to over-catalyze your market. What you want to do is get some projects built that get people interested in coming to Everett because there's a lot of new projects going, or a few new projects going. So there's some market criteria that the city will need to develop and monitor. We recommend that you watch closely your 8-year MFTE program and be ready to pull the plug on it when you feel you've gotten the incentive and the catalyst you want out of it. It's not something that should carry certainly no longer than 8 years, and maybe not that long. And that's because it eventually begins to compete with the net present value on the 12-year programs, and you want to make sure your 12-year programs are still affordable for the developers to use. So, and is there one more? Next steps. I have some work to do with Becky and Yorick to complete the report. We're certainly getting good feedback from folks. We're doing a little work to benchmark the incentive program. Here's our new starting point for the program and what does it mean. Measuring and monitoring and reporting toolkit. And then just implementation of the plan and seeking the funding. That's just a lot of staff time and collaboration with housing partners to make sure we're doing all we can to promote the opportunity to utilize these tools to develop multifamily housing in Everett. And just some monitoring information. I think we passed this by. And this is Yorick's rousing finish.
We're here today on February 21st, and then we're going to bring the 3 ordinances to the council as well as the background information, although a more abbreviated version of what we've shared with you today. That is all the rousing I've got left at this time in the evening, but I welcome continued discussion. I don't know that we got all the questions and answers out there.
Can I just ask about this report here? I know this is a final or a draft still. Who is the target audience, or who is the receiver of this? Is this just for everybody, or is there a particular target?
I think the target is, I think, twofold. One, staff. It's also a supporting document for a policy decision by City Council. And I believe that it's also a report for the Department of Commerce to give them feedback on the grant money that they gave us.
And the only reason I'm asking is I don't come from a planning background. I just, on the format of it and the way it's written, just some feedback for someone who is a much more lay person coming into this. I found that it seemed to me there was a lot of maybe kind of jargon and sometimes use of acronyms that I couldn't link up to what they meant. I also find that the pagination is a little confusing and hard to link the appendixes and the attachments to where it fits in. So maybe I would suggest some work on just how they're labeled and how they're numbered, so you can clearly like thumb through and look at the bottom right or something to appendix A, B, C. The way it's ordered just seemed a little bit, to me, disjointed, and I couldn't quite connect everything. So just feedback on the format. I did have one other question, something that I saw in there talking about affordability. It talked about inclusionary zones. That's a term I wasn't familiar with. And I guess is the recommendation of the report that the city consider inclusionary zones? Or
Do you mean inclusionary zoning?
inclusionary zoning, yeah, I'm sorry.
So maybe a definition of that might be helpful?
Inclusionary zoning is a tool that's available to cities that mandates developers build affordable units in exchange for building ordinary units. So if you want to zone your area, or if your area is upzoned for density, somebody can come into this area and they can build their units, but they're going to be mandatorily obligated to build some level of affordable units in their project.
With exemptions applying or not?
No, without exemptions
So I
applied.
guess I was just curious about that because that's kind of how I looked it up and I kind of understood that. It almost seemed to me that's almost like potentially a disincentive to development. If a developer can't get that to pencil out without an exemption, why would they ever even decide to build any project in a zone like that?
It depends on the type of zone. So for instance, not saying that it would be appropriate or could work out, but a transit hub, a sound transit station area could be a location where inclusionary zoning could work because there's such a concentration of housing and activity that's going to densify that area really, really heavily that it could actually pencil out in that manner. That's a possibility.
I see. One other question, I guess I got tons of questions, but try to prioritize them. Did you say that there is a comparison somewhere in here? I didn't see it about rents versus in Everett versus rents in Seattle or Linwood even. And I guess I'm just kind of shocked by the idea that fortunately I am a homeowner, so I don't have to worry about this, but I know some people who are renting, and it seems when we're looking at rents, the rents in Everett are high, and they didn't seem to be that much higher in some other jurisdictions, like even in Seattle, just anecdotally. So I guess I'm kind of surprised to hear that, because I'm assuming construction costs, land costs are about equivalent, and financing costs about equivalent, that there's such a disparity in rents between Everett and, say, even Linwood, that I guess that's kind of shocking to me. And I don't know how much, I mean, $100, is that enough to obliterate a project? $100 a unit difference? Anyway, that's just a shocking thing for me to hear, just from anecdotally what I understand to be rents that seem fairly comparable in Everett to a lot of other places around. So I'm surprised to hear that Everett can't work but Linwood can and Bothell can. I don't know, shocking.
I would encourage you to take a look at what average rents per jurisdiction around Puget Sound are. You can get online and look around, and you can find these average rent numbers for different jurisdictions. And just see wherever it sits relative to communities like Redmond or, Bothell or Mount Lake Terrace or Linwood or even Snohomish for that matter. And just kind of get a sense and see for yourself what is one of the challenges or big obstacles. City of Everett has old apartments, and it has a lot of really old rental units that are hidden away and squirreled away throughout the neighborhoods and communities that we have. And the average rent just doesn't stack up.
Yeah, and because that just seems like a big problem. I mean, obviously you can't build a project if you can't pay for it. But
So the Cushman-Wakefield memo has a little bit on that. American Community Survey from the Census Bureau has all of the data for different rents. Just one note of caution for everyone out there, the median rent is influenced by the mix of bedroom sizes. Our median rent is 70% of the median rent for Snohomish County, but we have a lot more one bedrooms, and so that would naturally drag down the median, even though it's not fair to compare a one bedroom rent to a three bedroom rent. When you look at them individually, our one bedrooms rent it was something like 85% of what Snohomish County. So there is a real measurable difference. Now that includes everything from a 1950 charming apartment to a 1970 not so charming apartment. So it's not directly comparing a new product that's exactly equal. But I think it is, the findings that I've seen is it is lower, and I guess it maybe only takes $1 if a developer has their choice of one or the other. And I think what Peter said about following kind of the herd mentality, there's safety in numbers, and when you see one domino fall in downtown Linwood, all of a sudden you see it's actually going the other way. The domino stands up. You see lots of other dominoes, and same thing in other light rail station areas especially. It's like a light flips, and all of a sudden every parcel. So I'm expecting that to happen in Everett as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be a steady trickle over a 20-year planning period. A lot of folks are wondering where the development is, and sometimes it's a catalyst like light rail or some other amenities to bring us back to that point that starts the stampede, and then connecting that to the MFTE 8-year when that stampede begins. If it begins, that would be the time to pull the plug on the free incentive and make sure that you're getting something for it, like the affordability.
Commissioner Zelinski.
Just a couple things. One is that the impact of light rail is not to be underestimated, and it seems like because of the scheduling of the Link project, we're going to be at a competitive disadvantage relative to Linwood and Mount Lake Terrace for some years to come. So we're going to be having to fight that battle. The other takeaway I had from reading the report was that it seems that the combination of the construction technology and cost and our rent levels means we're going to be limited to 7-story construction for the foreseeable future. Am I right in that? And I seem to recall some conversation some years back about some new revolutionary laminated timber construction or something that was supposed to revolutionize that. I haven't heard anything about that lately. Does anybody know what's going on with that?
Children's Museum is built with it, actually.
Oh,
So
is
it is in its maybe infancy, maybe toddlerhood. So there are projects that are starting to use it, and with everything, somebody's going to want to see it built from beginning to end and then watch it age well for a little bit. I think they're working on incentives to build a plant in Darrington to connect the forestry to the manufacturing side of it. So I'm hopeful for that to help close this gap with higher rise construction that doesn't have to pay the steel cost, yeah. But it's not like,
But
not like next year.
Yeah. In response to your question, I would not expect very many privately constructed or invested projects over 7 stories in Snohomish County. Very few. And the ones that you do see will probably be more public agency or institutional developments.
I guess I just want to make one other comment. Takeaway I had is when you're looking at these numbers, even, what you put, the building construction that we have had, it still seems woefully small for our projected need and overall pace thing. So while all of these incentives sound great, I guess I'm still seeing this and concerned that even the numbers that these are generating seem like we're just not, I guess it seems like kind of just disheartening that we're just never going to get ahead of this. I guess that's kind of a takeaway. Maybe I'm just a pessimist, but it's a little, frustrating and unfortunate to see that for all that is happening, it's not enough.
Well, what we've talked about tonight is just one tool that's in the box that the city has to incentivize or bring more housing. I know you've spent a lot of time looking at the ADU opportunities. There's a lot of just, smaller housing buildings going up in the 4-plex to 8-plex to, 16 units. They're beginning to spring up and densify. But the MFTE incentive program, it's not anything more than a piece. So, but I think it's an important piece because what it does do is it catalyzes investment that stimulates not only the development that the MFTE promotes, but ancillary development around it that will occur. You put 250, 300 people living in a multifamily unit at 75th and Evergreen Way, all of a sudden every store around there is doing better business and investors are upgrading the storefronts and the street amenities have been developed and safety happens. And there's all those intangibles that come along with it. Yeah, it's just a piece. It's not the only answer.
I'm sorry, I wanted to put a quick point on something that you mentioned, which is the connection to middle housing. So this whole report and this whole program is really focusing on the larger scale buildings and the larger scale development. When you stack up all of the different forms of housing, even a 5/1 apartment building is more expensive per unit to build than a 4-plex or a 6-plex, short wood, different contractors and everything. And that's not something that we looked in this report. But that is going to be a very important part of our strategy, I think, and that's why we're looking so hard at middle housing, because that's something that can be built. Little dribs and drabs all over the city can add up to big numbers at a pretty affordable price point.
That was a perfect segue to the two things you guys mentioned near the end. So when I look at this, I think, growth is really important. Going back to my main thesis, which is there's just a woeful underpopulation here in the city for us to be globally, economically competitive. What I think about when we do our land development, like in the Army, I'm sorry to keep referencing that. Everyone I work with is like, oh, hey, were you in the Army, Alex Lark? And obviously, because I mentioned it so much, but we look at the readiness of our soldiers. Are they green across the board? Are they trained? Are they equipped? Have they gone through all the training to be successful? And when I think about the same thing for our people, Are our people green across the board? Do they have childcare that's affordable, sustainable, and accessible? Do they have housing that's affordable, sustainable, accessible? Do they have medical care that's affordable, sustainable, and accessible? Are we as a institution, a community, in whatever mix we want to, and in whatever combination we want to do that, facilitating that? Because at the end state is to make sure people have successful lives, so they do things that are commercially successful, socially successful, and personally successful, and build a better world in their own little corner of it. And when I look at, like, what are we doing for readiness? Are we green across the board? The answer is no. Like, catastrophically no. Childcare, it's like catastrophically expensive, $1,700 to $2,500 to $3,000 a month here in Snohomish County. Yeah. If you can get a spot. Housing, we have talked about affordability, and we're saying, hey, the rents have to go up for us to even build more. Not green across the board. Yeah, we get that apartment building here, but is anyone gonna be able to afford to go out and, make use of the amenities to go to those storefronts if our wages aren't kept up? Do we have, like, is the student debt issue taken care of? Is this person's health care taken care of? And the answer is no, no, no. And we're waiting at the national level for this stuff to get done. Fantastic, waiting for a train that don't come. But here at the local level, we need to take initiative on that. So the question is, are we building zoning that will are we doing a fiscally responsible zoning to generate tax revenue, to aggregate resources, to achieve those end states? So when I think about zoning and the comp plan, is zoning building us towards readiness? Is zoning building capabilities for our citizens? And so we may build these multifamily tax credit, these buildings, which I think we should. And the analysis actually in this is spectacular, and I really enjoyed reading it. And so I want to say thank you for writing it. But I think it carves out a very important slice of analysis. But as we think about the comp plan going forward, we need to carve out a lot more analysis going like, how will these buildings and this zoning set us up to be economically competitive and for our citizens to be green across the board, to have a good life? And so we need that fiscal analysis. So as we build and develop and cultivate this community, are we resourcing ourselves to further build, cultivate, and develop ourselves in it? So I really want to see that analysis as we go into the comp plan discussion, because we'll never get ahead of it if we don't do that. Because if we're waiting on light rail, we're always going to be behind. If we're waiting on rents, we're always going to be behind. If we're waiting on the market, if we're always waiting on somebody else, there's no way in this gosh darn world that we're ever going to get ahead of the problem. So we need to think about how are we resourcing ourselves to set ourselves ahead of. So that's just like my request. That's why I think we need to have a discussion about fiscal zoning, so we know what our resources are, so we can just chart our own course and not have to wait for the market. Because we make our own market. Don't worry about where the enemy will be, worry about where you will be and make them worry about that. So, that's remarks complete.
Thank you. Any additional questions, comments, commissioners? While you're thinking, I just want to ask a quick question regarding the rents. Because, anecdotally, what Commissioner Yanisek said about knowing folks that just pay an arm and a leg for rent. Yeah, I completely agree. Like families paying, $3,500 a month for their apartment. But I also know that tucked into neighborhoods, like, for example, my neighborhood, Pinehurst Beverly Park, there are units that rent for older homes, maybe below what you might consider market rate and whatnot. So since this study was focused on larger developments, when you were looking at average rents, did you include all rents or just rents in developments that were comparable to what this report was covering?
We had to look at the average rent across all rentals in the city of Everett, but we also looked at what the average apartment rentals were in the city of Everett, which gave us, I think, a better understanding of what newer apartments would need to provide in order to get comparable rents. There's been a lot of new development that's gone in, and it was nice to be able to get some of the newer information on some of those rents that are out there, just online searches. But yeah, we looked at it two ways. One, rent across the city for all rental properties, and then what's available in the apartment market.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Additional questions, comments? Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. Do we have anyone online who wishes to comment? Kathy?
Guest at extension 0007. Please unmute if you would like to provide public comment.
Thank you. Thank you, I appreciate that. Moving on to item B, the Planning Commission bylaws.
I wanted to point out that if we are planning on taking action tonight, the bylaws can only be amended by a vote of at least 5 regular members of the Planning Commission, in which unfortunately Commissioner Lark and I do not qualify.
Yeah, I saw that too at the very
Yeah.
beginning of the meeting,
I-
and there appears to be a discrepancy.
Yeah, I think
Chair
that we did vote to approve one of the changes, which is the language around the vice chair. So that vote has already taken place. So this was just implementation of that language, but the vote regarding adjusting all of the language to be gender neutral, that would need to be a second vote. And I
Yep.
think that that is correct, that we could not do that this evening.
Well, it depends. So in Article 4, Section 2, page 2, halfway down there, alternates shall have the privilege of participating in all discussions before the commission and shall serve as a voting member in the absence of regular members, and when serving shall have the same powers and responsibilities as duly appointed members. Now, that somewhat conflicts with the last sentence in the bylaws, but
That
If
is
you're-
what it,
if-
that is what it says.
yeah, it came first, so it wins.
That is what it says. So there were a couple of amendments that I'd like to propose to the copies that you received. One is under Section 4, so the language that we approved prior, just a bit of tweaking of that, I guess you would say. Section 4 reads, sentence 2 says, "The vice chairperson shall be an appointed or alternate member of the commission, and that the voting is to be in accordance with Article 4, Section 2, et cetera." I would like to amend that language to appointed or alternate member of the commission, and their voting shall be in accordance with Article 4. So it's just kind of correcting the flow of language there. And I think that we already kind of approved that. This is just refining that. The other changes were some spots where we missed a bit of the transitioning of the language from gendered to gender neutral. Section 2, there was a sentence there that utilizes he and her, his and her, and then also Article 7, there were several points within that section where the language was not fully corrected to be gender neutral. 3 instances specifically in Article 7.
Would you like us to try again next month?
We can do that, yeah. I think that it might be helpful just to see all of those changes so everyone can have a clean copy that they vote on. Although those are, we could actually vote to approve with those specific amendments. Commissioners, how do you feel about that?
I think if those are the only amendments proposed, then that makes sense to vote on it now and put it aside so that we can address other issues next month.
I second that.
Okay, I'll entertain a motion to approve with amendments.
I would second that.
I guess point of information,
yes,
can we like quickly check city code just to make sure that Commissioner Lark and I voting on this is not in violation?
That would be an amendment, not the final passage though, correct? Because we're just amending this for the next review.
We're
Well,
amending the draft?
Yes.
We already voted with 5 regular members to approve the change to the vice chair position. That language has been voted on and approved. So this is just refining the language, correcting the language. The other portion, which was to modify all gendered language to be gender-neutral language, that would be, we would be amending the proposed draft to complete that task, because the proposed draft, it is not completed in this draft.
So I think the amendment of the to gender-neutral language, we wouldn't need 5 members because we're not, final passage is amending.
Well, we are voting to approve this draft with the amendments that we are discussing to the draft right now in real time. And so the question is, can you and Commissioner Adkins perform the vote as regular members because you have that power? And so that was what York was, that's what he was referencing in Article 4, where it says, Section 2, if you go down mid-paragraph, the alternates shall have the privilege of participating in all discussions before the commission and shall serve as a voting member in the absence of regular members, and when serving shall have the same powers and responsibilities as duly appointed members. So because you, Commissioner Larkin, Commissioner Adkins, were recognized as having the powers of regular voting members today, can we move forward? So that's the question.
And for my read of code, the planning commission shall adopt rules for transaction of business and shall keep a written record of its meetings. So I think how you operate is up to you. So it's just if you're comfortable with this,
I just point out, there does seem to be a conflict of language too, if this is duly appointed versus regular.
Yeah, because if you go, that's kind of the
So
issue
what
in
is the
back of
difference
my
between
mind.
those two things?
Well, I'm
Is a
certainly not
regular,
regular.
a regular member doesn't necessarily have to be could be an appointed
Well,
or
under
an alternate
amendments,
maybe, I don't know.
if you look at the Article 9, which covers amendments, it says these bylaws may be amended by a vote of at least 5 regular members. So if we use that language as the framework and we go back to Article 4, Section 2, it says they shall have the same powers and responsibilities as,
Yeah.
I thought that language aligned. It didn't. You're right about that. So, but because we do have the power to decide how we want to operate, we have a little bit of leeway. And so I guess it really comes down to what commissioners feel comfortable with.
I also want to bring up the point that, at least in code, it also says duly appointed commission members when referencing alternates. It says alternates shall serve in the absence of members when so asked by the commission chairperson, and when serving shall have the same powers and responsibilities as duly appointed commission members. And I can't find any reference to regular members.
Yeah, so it sounds like a duly appointed member is someone who is not an alternate member. That's the distinguishing, but then regular member could include both, or it could be one or the other.
We should
So-
probably just
That is probably
harmonize the
something
language.
we need to harmonize. I would guess that would be something we should probably amend while we're at it as well.
You know, would someone like to make a motion that we amend that language to align it? And perhaps we can have a clean draft for next time and move it through the process a little more quickly.
So moved.
Seconded.
Okay, Kathy, would you please take the roll?
I'm yes.
Commissioner Lark,
I'm yes.
Commissioner Yanusak,
Yes, although, yes.
Yes.
Commissioner McGann, Commissioner Zelinski,
Yes.
Commissioner Atkins,
Yes.
Chair Chatters.
Yes, thank you.
Although, Chair, I would think we probably then need to decide which one we want to go with while we're here.
Duly-
Oh, I thought it was implied that it was duly appointed.
So we're
Right,
gonna
yeah,
change
'cause
regular,
that's the-
so we're gonna change regular to duly appointed.
Yes, to align it with what the code says.
Okay.
So we're on Article 9, we're just going to say, vote
Yeah, you didn't know it takes you back.
by duly appointed.
And so Kathy, I can provide you with my copy that I've marked up.
Oh, good.
So we
Okay.
can have that together. Okay,
Stars have to line up all 5 presents
moving
right
on to additional new business. Do we have any additional new business? If we do not have additional new business, then I believe we are adjourned for the evening.
That would make sense.
we want to bring up the land.
Do you have additional new business, Commissioner Atkins?
Yes, I
Okay.
unfortunately do have additional new business, but I promise you this will be fairly quick. I was hoping that we could have a discussion at our next meeting about having land acknowledgements, just at the beginning of the agenda. That's it.
Brilliant, love it. I do, not new business, but I want to reiterate, we need to have a planning commission meeting that at least dedicates time to fiscal zoning. Like, I can't emphasize that enough, and I want to be very clear in that on the record.
Any final
Sure.
thoughts from commissioners?
I've got a question.
Yes.
What would you like staff to prepare for a discussion, if anything, about a land acknowledgement? So generally, when done right, this is a process that brings in tribal members that are affected by it and all that. Are you thinking to start the discussion just among the planning commission about how to go about the business at the next meeting?
I think it honestly be appropriate for us to just follow council's lead and just utilize the land acknowledgement that they've already consulted with the Tulalip tribes on.
And I didn't mean to fast forward to the actual discussion, just wanted to make sure that there wasn't anything that we could prepare to support that. So if that works, we'll see you in a month for that discussion.
So that will be added to the agenda for March.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, yes. So, Commissioner Fisher?